G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and a great end to your week. I hope your weekend is gearing up to be fantastic. Now legends, of course, always we have a lot to speak about. And of course on this channel we speak about everything from tactics, battlefield on the front line to diplomacy, negotiations, politics, because we know war like this, protracted, attritional, large-scale war has a quantum-like connection between the very front line and politics, that these are not mutually exclusive. So we'll speak all between that. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, everything will be to codify the battlefield reality. So we have a lot to go for. Of course, we'll be looking at the maps. But something I want to share with you right in the beginning is a conversation. I can share some parts of this between me and one of my Ukrainian friends. And I keep in a lot of contact with people I know from then doing these videos all back to the months and months that I'd spent in Ukraine. And I think this will tie together how a lot of people are feeling, not only internally with the corruption scandal, but also towards the US, towards Europe, and the war overall. And this is going to tie together our political side of the video today to do with frozen assets. And we have a new bloody agent has entered the villa. Apparently now, the Belgian Prime Minister is working for the SBR or the FSB. Why? Well, he's taking a completely reasonable, rational decision against the frozen assets. His position is completely reasonable, saying, if you want us to touch this, we need guarantees of you asking us to do it, that we're not going to be left holding the bag and going bankrupt. Completely reasonable position. But of course, if you don't live in the clouds in this idealistic unicorn fairy tale in Europe at the moment, if you don't live in that, you're an agent of a state. And then this will tie together as well, in the beginning with my friend's email, down to then population collapse and the demographic crises that Ukraine is facing. Of course, the war is exacerbating this massively. And what is there in the future, regardless of where this border really lies and the impacts that this will have, and how this may tell us about then negotiations, diplomacy, ending of wars. So, legends, a lot to go over. Thank you for being here with me again. Now, firstly, I want to cover off on just this part of our conversation that I can share. So we're speaking about then our time in Afghanistan and Ukraine. Now, what I guess I wanted to reflect on is the combined effects of a corruption scandal this massive. Of course, what is going through Kyiv at the time. The US and Russia negotiating behind Ukraine's back, with Europe apparently surprised by this. And no, I don't believe the presidential administration here in Kyiv saying that we were unaware either. It doesn't believe you were unaware of this. And us, sitting in the dark and cold. I'm since over 24 hours without power in the middle of the bloody capital due to Russian attacks, to the point that I begin missing open fires and the maddening sound of generators in Kabul. I'm starting to lose hope in the last place where I thought this possible. I'm starting to lose hope, not in Ukraine. We can be thankful for the inspiration our Ukrainian friends are here to give us, but in the proverbial West that my parents cherished and brought me up to admire. I'm personally crippled by the precocity of US politics, with some notable exceptions. The haphazard and ultimately irrational responses from European capitals. In my humble opinion, this risks losing not Ukraine, but the whole of Eastern Europe for decades. I don't know that it's not already lost, to be honest. So looking at how the US is playing, how the European capitals are playing, and seeing that they are at the last end, because of course he's sitting there in the power and the cold and seeing the war unfold, and the huge issues that then are arising, and we'll go into then the frozen assets, population collapse later on. I think this will just set good groundwork. And thank you for being a good friend of mine. So let's go onto the maps and look at the situation. Now, of course, we have Ukraine here in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 2022. Purple, 2014, red check, confirmed Russian ground over the past 24 hours. Confirmed because this is the Ukrainian map. Now, I missed something yesterday that I shouldn't have, and I apologize for this. These numbers. Now, what we say is, in a war of attrition like this, that territory, kilometre squares, is not the best barometer of movement of who is winning, because you could absolutely be winning an attritional war moving rearwards or stationary. Absolutely. But this does give us an idea of taking ground. It gives an idea of negotiating leverage, but also when we see speeding up, goes against the linear warfare pros, and who doesn't love to push back against that? But what I missed yesterday is you can see we had a record month, but what really stood out was the difference in kilometre squares in the totals so far. And we see the difference between deep state, difference between AMK at 40%, over 1,500 square kilometres different. And you can just see in these different maps, and it tells you a lot about how information is used in then this war and the differences in the mapping, the grey zone in the mapping, the geolocations as well. It just paints the picture that we are trying to be as accurate as possible, and this is why we share everything. So let's move down into the south. The south is the area of which concerns me the most. Even the linear warfare bros, they're saying, don't worry, Zaporizhzhia in 6 months. And I'm saying, excuse me? I am worried about that, mate. If it's a city 5-7 times the size of the last remaining ones in the Donbass. So let's move down. No movement shown on this map today, but of course, a lot of eyes are focused around the Guliapol frontline, Dobropilia area. So let's move down into here. And why does this concern us? Well, where the Russians are pushing is north side of the fortifications, which are to take from a northern assault. But because the Russians are pushing west, the fortifications are basically being bypassed. So let's have a look at Guliapol. Now, this is then Mr. AMK mapping. You can see Guliapol down here, movement into the outskirts of here, but also this movement into Dobropilia and then pushing down to the south. So into Dobropilia and then down through Priluki and Varvarivkia, as well as Suryak map spoke about yesterday. And this is why we share so many different sources. We try to get an idea and a happy medium between this so we can confirm where there's movements. But you can see that even the geolocations that have popped up from Novo Zaporizhzhia, Dobropilia in here is still well outside of what the grey zone is being shown here. And I understand that there's porosity on the front line in this sector, but if there's a dude there with the flag, with an AKS, you should probably have that as grey zone. If your warriors in this area are using this map to know where is red zone, where is safe zone. Let's move to the west of here. And of course, we have Stepnohursk, the island boys of Stepnohursk hanging out here. Let's talk about this. So we do see, according to AMK, more movement of the Russian forces through Stepnohursk and then leveraging off the Dnieper River just to the west in this sector as well. So in there and then Stepnohursk actual. And then we come just to the east of here. We're talking Otakhiv. Of course, this is where, this small part left here, this is where the Ukrainians pushed on the now infamous 2023 counter-offensive. Now, most of this counter-offensive ground has been then pushed back, not by kilometre squares, just in this sector. By kilometre squares is many times over. Let's have a look in here. Movement up near Novodanilivka front. So movement then up this road into Novodanilivka as this turns back. And again, we see a lot of effort being put on this southern front. And this has a lot of ramifications, especially for somewhere like Zaporizhzhia, but as well, if it was ever to mount another offensive, this is the weaker spot that's becoming far, far more powerful and much further to push. You can see why the Russians are pushing in this sector. And then we'll come back around the Guliapol area, but Velika Novosilka. So we see the blue around Ivanivka, Filia area. And this is further confirmed by AMK today, with Ivanivka coming back under the control of the Russian forces and then using this creek line here as a natural barrier. We've seen this area go forward and back a few times. And then if we zoom out on Ivanivka, we come just to the west of here. We're looking, we call this typically the Velika Western Front. We're looking for Vidrane right in here, as well as Tikhe. And this is an area where you can get the scale difference on these maps and how there's 1,600 kilometre squares different over the year. So let's have a look here. AMK, Tikhe, he's showing Russian Western movement out of here, expanding that, which of course we have spoken many times about desaturating and expanding. If you push north, you have to push east and west. A little bit of ground made near Veliko Magalivkia, and then down around Danilivka, Vidrane front, then reaching through Vidrane to this road. And you can see this whole front line from Guliapol, where we were, through Dobropilia to Vidrane to Tikhe, that these two areas are vastly different. And although it may only be a smaller-ish difference over 1 month, when we go back to this and look at the total, so I'm disappointed I missed it, we see that they are very, very significant. And I guess there's going to be a point in time that Deep State is going to have to do some very large catching up, especially because of the geolocations that we're seeing in these areas. Right, let's move across to Pokrovsk. We see our first bit of red check. So we have, of course, Minograd, this real grey zone expansion into Novokonomanchne. If we push back in here, you can see where then this has shrunk up grey zone going And what we do know is this is likely much tighter than this is showing. And you know it's not good when you start getting the Minograd holds, when you start getting Pokrovsk holds, Bakhmut holds, when you start getting this. Again, I don't see the bragging about being in a surrounded, operationally encircled at best, physically encircled most likely part, getting smashed by FABs. I don't see the bragging about the catastrophic situation which is in here. This is why I've said this is going to be an informational turning point. So let's have a look at Pokrovsk. So we have the AMK mapping. He shows at the base of Minograd, the Russians are pushing up. We've spoken a lot about keeping the base of an encirclement engaged, and then out towards Heroshnay, where the Russians are pushing. We did see a couple of weeks back really trying to push up in this direction, and have turned this from like a pinch encirclement to like a tunnel, and to leave out of here is going to be very, very costly, or it already is costly for the movements and the units trying to come in or out. Come to the north of here, we have the Shakhovka Island boys. Now, this area, this has been ignored on this map for some time, but Suryak, AMK, they've had basically daily updates speaking on this area, and today is no different. So we have Dorozhny down here. So this is then Dorozhny here. Sorry, my map was freaking out a little bit. Then we have Nova Shakhovka, Sofivka, and you can see these maps vastly different. Nova Shakhovka saying the Russians have moved back into here, then made some ground through Sofivka, and as well where the Ukrainians have pushed back the direction of Shakhovka. As well, then around Zatishtok, that these are looking vastly different. This is just in this sector in here to the south of Dorozhny. So this northern movement of Pokrovsk, that according to him, is growing around as well. Of course, then further deepening the envelopment that we have seen take place. Now, let's move just to the east of here, and then we have Konstantinivka area. Of course, some grey zone reaching into here, and some saying all roads eventually lead to Konstantinivka. So we have building on the base sector in here from Pleshkivka all the way to Perechny as well, building on the base of here. Still all this shown in grey zone or not in grey zone, but again, doesn't align with geolocations we've seen unfold over a number of months. What interested me today was the east of Konstantinivka, or northeast, Chasiv Yar, is that the Russians are now building on this front as well to push around. So you can just see, this is Chasiv Yar right here. So see where this movement is coming down, then the rail line. So movement out in this direction where we can see that Mayske push from last week. And of course, what is that there to do? Eventually build the northern flank of what will become an envelopment of Konstantinivka, along with where Sofivka is at the moment, where there's a lot of effort pushing on that. Last update is from Suryak maps. We'll continue our way up. We see Yampil, red check, confirmed movement through here. Then we see where the Turney pocket has formed. Zoom in on the Borosivka and Rivkia front, and we see Suryak maps showing that to the north of here, Zadazove area in the direction of Buhuslavka coming under further control. And then last update for you on the maps is up in Vovchansk. What we see is update here, Tiki, Vovchansk, still Vilcha shown, not in grey, still in green. We see Russian movement through here. Now, what we have been reporting is that other mappers, they've been showing that most of, if not all, of Vovchansk is now under Russian control. So that confirms there's definitely movement on here. We have spoken about, and AMK was the one who was first privy to it, along the Donetsk River here. You could see this whole sector in here come under control relatively quickly. There's massive potential for that. So legends, that is the end of the mapping, but not the end of the video. Let's talk about frozen assets, and we'll give a bit of a TLDR on this because this is being massively skewed, taken out of context, and people are being ridiculous about it. Remember, if you don't live up with the unicorns, you work for the SVR. Politico is this: how Belgium became Russia's most valuable asset. Asset? Really? Prime Minister Bart de Wever is blocking a raid on Moscow's frozen funds to help Ukraine. Can anyone change his mind? Actually, yes. The European states could change his mind by not leaving Belgium out to dry if this goes south, which most likely it will. And this entire situation, it really does show us the extra chromosomal buck-passing bullshit that has turned Europe, the centre of thinking, the centre of culture, the centre of art, into a laughingstock of postmodernist relativism. This is a great example of that. And when we say Russia has no capacity to be able to invade NATO or Europe, that's a ridiculous sentiment. This makes me think that maybe they could, because if these states can't work together to free up these assets, they're not willing to help each other out in this. How confident are we in NATO 5 that if Latvia or Estonia gets hit, that all these other nations are going to come and help them out when we're just talking legally binding terms on this that is reasonable? Again, I'm going to have to think about that more, but and then we see this whole, the Belgian PN is a Russian asset, he's an agent, he's this, he's that. Or does he, as the leader of a sovereign, independent nation, have a responsibility to put his nation first? That is a very rare idea for many leaders. But the conditions of which he is set are very reasonable. We'll give a TLDR, too long didn't read, of the situation. Basically saying if we steal these assets and spend them, that we will highly likely be liable to repay in the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. We didn't even do this against Hitler in the Second World War, so there's no precedent for it. But if we do it, we're happy to do it, but we could be liable because most of these assets are in our banks. We will touch these, but the conditions is that we share the burden, we pay it back all together, because if we have to, we'll be bankrupt. Again, this money that you're asking Belgium to free up and risk themselves, it's not going to be spent in Belgium, but they're going to be wearing all the risk. It's going to be spent in German defense manufacturers, in American companies, but Belgium wears all the risk. I wish I could get a $100 billion loan and you wear all the risk, and if you can't pay it back, well, someone else is coming after you and I've just got all this money. You see, then people like Ursula von der Leyen just furious about this. And the West as well still has billions of assets in Russia, of which Russia could freeze in response to this. And if you use these assets, at best, a couple $100 billion is maybe 2 more years of war. This doesn't include the near $1 trillion it may cost to rebuild Ukraine. But the biggest part I see with these assets is, much like the longer range missile systems, is it more valuable as a card that you can threaten with than actually the outcome of it? Because once you've reached the top of the escalation ladder, you don't have anywhere else to go. And this is what people speculate about the Tomahawks, is the threat of Tomahawks may be more useful in negotiations than actually the Tomahawk as a kinetic offensive weapon. And these frozen assets could be the same. If you play this card, and I believe Russia's already written off this money, but if you play this card, once you're out, where then you go? That this is really one of the last cards. What, you're going to do 21st, 22nd sanctions packages are going to have less and less effect. But also, what precedent does this set for the stability, the credibility of the euro following? So let's look at what he has actually said that's got people, of course, up in arms. Shared by this newspaper here, that but the weather, Moscow has made it clear to us that if his assets are seized, Belgium and I will feel the consequences for eternity. He spoke to this paper right here. You can go look it up. You just need to translate it. Now, I was asked, is the issue of frozen Russian assets is taking up a huge amount of your time and energy? Is that fair? He says the pressure surrounding this issue is incredible. I have a team working day and night on it. It would be a nice story, taking money from the bad guy, Putin, giving it to the good guy, Ukraine. But stealing frozen assets from another country, its sovereign wealth funds, has never been done before. This is money from the Central Bank of Russia. Even during World War II, Germany's money wasn't confiscated. During a war, sovereign wealth funds are frozen. At the end of the war, the losing state must relinquish all or part of these assets to compensate the victors. But who really believes Russia will lose in Ukraine? Remember, this is what he's saying. Who really believes that Russia's going to lose? It's a fable, a complete illusion. It's not even desirable for them to lose and for instability to take a hold in the country that possesses nuclear weapons. And this is something that we have spoken about, that there's incentive to stretch Russia, to weaken Russia, but never to collapse Russia. You'll never give enough to do that because at the end of the day, you're going to have a nuclear-armed state, unstable, collapsing on your border. We've spoken about how the Europeans especially, and the Americans, are treading a very fine line of enough to delay, enough to weaken, but never enough to win. And who believes that Putin will calmly accept the confiscation of Russian assets? Moscow has let us know in the event of a seizure, Belgium and I personally will feel the effects for eternity. That seems like a pretty long time. Russia could also confiscate certain Western assets. Euroclear has 16 billion in Russia. All Belgian factories in Russia could also be seized. And what if Belarus and China also confiscated Western assets? Have we considered all of this? No, we haven't. I asked my European colleagues if they would be willing to pool the risks incurred by Belgium. Only Germany said it was ready to do so. Without this pooling of resources, I will do everything I can to block this case. Again, this is where we have said he is being completely reasonable given the battlefield situation, reasonable given larger strategic situation. But this is the last part in here. That have we actually spoken about pooling risks? We've said, yes, we were willing to do it if we pool the risks. Only Germany is saying they're willing to do it. And if you're not willing to pool the risks, you're not working together, we're not willing to do it because we're going to be left holding the bag. After this episode, I'll have an international job after the 16th. So we know they're going to be meeting on the 16th of December to discuss this further. Where do I think it's going to go? I think it's going to go ahead without Belgium. I think they're going to pull some bullshit out of their ass and do it. And again, we're just seeing the foundations of the European Union start just eroding and eroding and eroding faster and faster and faster. And what I see in this is it may not make you happy, but does he tell any lies in here? You may call him an ass. Is he lying? No. Let's look at this. And many people have shared this today. And it's just the heartbreaking nature of war. Reuters has an article. Ukraine stares down the barrel of a population collapse. While many Ukrainian hospitals are struggling to cope with the endless influx of wounded, a maternity ward in the western town of Hoshka lies eerily deserted. The hospital has recorded just 139 births this year, down from 164 in 24, far cry from over a decade ago where 400 babies were born every year. A gynecologist said many young men have died. Young men who, bluntly speaking, were supposed to replenish Ukraine's gene pool. And this is the existential nature and the paradox of this war, though, is Zelensky's not willing to mobilise these 18-year-olds because of the existential nature of the demographics, but without doing that, it's existential for the war too. That's the paradox that we are stuck in. But this is the horrible nature of protracted attritional war. Not only have millions fled from a country already struggling demographically, but many of those will not return, especially if a peace deal is anything less than the original victory that Zelensky and the West promised. 91 borders, NATO, EU, large forces. Many, that is their condition on returning. Many won't return anyway. Just look at the opportunities in Ukraine versus maybe Germany or Australia or America. What can't be measured yet is post-war attrition. So you can measure those that have fled, you can measure those who have been killed or wounded. But after the war, the scars of war, they remain. I know Australia has lost more than 10 times the men who were in Afghanistan after than we lost in Afghanistan. Of course, from taking our own lives, alcoholism, inability to work, that post-war attrition. Now, typically, defending nation fighting at home, has a better outcome with this than nation crossing borders, but still, it's a huge deal. But this is the brutal, savage, inhumane effectiveness of attritional war compared to shorter, sharper, overtaking war. The goal of an attritional war is to destroy your opponent's potential. And sadly, there is a real situation where the shooting of the war ends, but Ukraine still collapses and succumbs to Russian pressure due to a collapse following in then population. Now, as I've said time and time again, Ukraine is Ukrainians before it is a border on a map. In the battle for a line on the map, there is a real risk for the existence of the state. And you may not like it, but this is what I think people are missing in Kyiv and in Brussels, speaking about this war and going, okay, we want to continue, we want to do this, but are you rolling the dice for the existence of the state for a bad deal when the only other option is catastrophic? Belgian PM seems to agree with what I've said. Now, obviously, I hate war, but there is a bit of truth that repeats across history, that wars that are won quickly often then fail strategically because the defeated society remains intact enough to then further resist. If you take a country quickly, surgically, the people, the state, and the culture, they survive, and their identity and their fighting spirit remains. They can rebuild, reorganize, and then keep resisting following. Attritional war is the opposite of this. It just grinds everything in its path. It erodes internally. You see it, military, civilian alike. It kills anyone that stands in the way. It tears apart the institutions that hold nations together. It breaks the population to the point where resistance becomes impossible. We see no one is signing up anymore. It's not about taking land. It's about destroying the opponent's future capacity to exist as a coherent state. Germany taking France in World War II versus how the Soviets took Germany is a very clear example of this resistance following. The brutal reality is very simple. Quick victories leave something behind to fight for later. Attrition leaves nothing. It's scorched earth. When a country falls fast, its people rise again. When a country is bled out slowly, there is no one left to stand up. And this is how we're seeing that just slow grind forward. And this is why it is catastrophic, especially when you're looking at a country already with demographic issues. Saying once the war ends, who will be left to rebuild this shattered country? Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or wounded in almost 4 years of fighting, while millions have fled the country and births are drying up. Millions of people are needed to rebuild. Ukraine's population is 42 million before the full-scale invasion in 22, has already shrunk to below 36 million, including several million in areas captured by Russia. It estimates the figure will drop to 25 million by 2051. This is skewed massively. Now, how is this skewed? It is correct, but again, this is a bit of a pseudo-environment. It doesn't take into account those that have fled. It's assuming all of those are going to come back. It also assumes in this that those people in occupied territories will one day return. So the population with several million in these areas, it's also assuming that this is coming back under then Kiev's government, under Ukraine. This is how that has been skewed. The collapse is gathering pace. The country has both the highest death rates and the lowest birth rates in the world, according to the CIA World Factbook. According to government estimates, Ukraine's average male life expectancy dropped from 65.2 before the war to 57 years in 24. The female figure fell as well. Ukraine would need millions of people to rebuild its shattered economy. Sectors that would most need is in labour, included construction, technology, administrative services. Many sectors which are being destroyed, so say the mining sector, the electrical plants, all of this is where men are the majority of the workers, especially in a conservative religious state like Ukraine. Of course, they needed to rebuild here. They rebuild the roads, rebuild the factories, work in the factories, but it is men who overwhelmingly wear the brunt of war. But we never hear anything about that, about equality. We speak about CEOs. We don't speak about people being dragged off the street to go and fight. And if push came to shove, the most liberal states would still do it. The strategy centres on stemming further emigration and luring Ukrainians back. So to try and get people back and save Ukraine, that you're trying to have people come back in. But again, a lot of this is conditional on how the war ends. Authorities estimate these measures could push the population back up to 34 million by 2040, but also warn they could fall to 29 million by then if the current dynamics continue. I would say you are very lucky to have 29 million at this point in time. Parents take their children out of the country before they reach 18. Kiev has barred most men over 18 from leaving the country during the war, although Zelensky has raised the age to 22. So, of course, trying to leave. And 4 years on, kids were 14, who now could be called up. Ukraine, whose population exceeded 48 million in 2001, has faced demographic decline since. The exodus, accelerated by Russia invaded, prompted millions more to flee. Now, Japan is evidence that unchecked immigration can be more destructive than losing a war and having 2 literal suns dropped on your cities. Of course, Japan, we will see a demographic collapse there also, but they have decided to keep their culture intact. They've gone a different road to other states. But given this phenomenon and the current state of Western European states, the immigration there, issues that we see, there will be very little appetite for Ukraine to accept mass migration we see in a demographic crisis. Ukraine is heralded between your idiots who work in some of the higher echelons of Kaja Kallas and von der Leyen, all this. It's heralded as this progressive, liberal state, and this could not be further from the truth. Look at the recent attempts to hold pride parades. Look at some of the reactions from, say, nationalist units. Look at the discrimination against Indian students. Ukraine is a highly conservative and religious state. Now, I've no issue. Ukraine can be any way that it wants. But this idea that it is this like progressive, alt-liberal state is just made up in the media. But if Europe's plan for demographics here is mass Middle Eastern or Asian immigration into Ukraine, good luck. But I don't see the other solution here, especially if a lot of this is conditional. What I mean by conditions is then these people who have left Ukraine and fled coming back. The Centre for Economic Strategy, a Ukrainian think tank, said in March that 5.2 million Ukrainians had left since the invasion to countries like Russia, Germany, Poland. This is what a lot of people forget. Massive amounts of people who fled didn't just go to Germany and Poland and here. A lot went to Russia. The Centre predicted 1.7 to 2.7 billion of those people would remain abroad, so not coming back, that they are out. But they are overwhelmingly overrepresented by young women and children. Since the population crisis was exacerbated by the fact younger women are disproportionately represented among refugees since 22. Independent predictions are alarming. So independent predictions, Ukraine's population is expected to fall to between 9 and 23 million by the year 2100. Again, this is going to be skewed because it's going to use Ukraine's internationally recognised borders. From my reading, my knowledge on this war, more like 12 million people have fled, from a starting point just over 30 million, and only 30% plan on actually returning, with conditions given mostly around territory and security, of which most likely in this war we are not going to see those conditions anywhere near being met. So how does this look following? It can create a catastrophe. This Anastasia Yaschuk, she speaks about that many of her friends are hesitant to have children. She has no intention of doing so in the next couple of years. And I will say, Anastasia, that many, even in the West, who are not at war, feel very much the same way. There's just no stability. There's nothing to build upon. The existing financial pressures have been exacerbated by war. It's very hard for young people to buy a home now. We need to be financially stable, both me and my partner. The situation in the country is changing all the time, every month or two. So I had to plan, especially with partner can be then off to war. Now, the circumstances that these regular people find themselves in is truly heartbreaking. Regardless of where this war ends, Russia will remain on Ukraine's border as a looming and growing force. So we'll continue to exacerbate this as well. Europe, they have jettisoned, thrown out multiple peace processes on the promise of defeating Russia and delivering a more prosperous future for Ukraine. Therefore, I believe they carry the responsibility to give Ukraine the best possible hope for a future. If they have scuttled chances at peace 3.5 more years ago, they've scuttled this on the idea that their largest competitor was going to be worn down by a third country, being Ukraine. So to wear down Russia, we're going to basically use this state. Boris Johnson has called it a proxy war. Then you have the responsibility to give the best possible hope for a future. What we've seen, though, is that Europeans can't see eye to eye on anything at the moment. It's just incredibly ineffective and inefficient trying to do anything within the red tape, the bureaucracy. But you can see the heartbreak in this, but you can see why an attritional strategy is so effective. If you had taken Pokrovsk, let's take Pokrovsk for example. If Russia was able to have a mechanized maneuver and take Pokrovsk in 2 weeks and there's still 60,000 people left in here, motivated soldiers and this and that, you get the resistance. But the way this has occurred, because forced, because you can't have maneuver warfare in a drone environment, but this just grind up, destroying everything in here. End of the day, it's very effective to hold areas, but the brutality of it is just unbelievable. But this is large-scale war, and this is why I think we need to do all we can to avoid this. And as Trump says, and I disagree with a lot of what Trump says, I agree with this was avoidable, absolutely. And we need to look in the future and go, we can avoid more catastrophic wars than this. This is still very limited given, but all I see is world leaders just walking head on into it because it will not be their sons or themselves who are fighting in this war. Legends, look after yourselves. Have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.